4,800 years ago, on the eastern bank of the Nile, 265 kilometers south of Cairo, a man in his 60s was lowered into a clay pot, curled in on himself like a sleeping child, and sealed inside a tomb cut into the limestone cliffs above the river. The pyramids of Giza were rising 200 kilometers to the north. He would not have been a builder. He was buried before artificial mummification became standard practice, with the care reserved for someone above the working class, in a vessel no one disturbed for nearly 5,000 years. In 1902, a British expedition led by John Garstang opened the tomb, lifted the pot from the cliff, and shipped the skeleton inside it to Liverpool. It sat in museum storage for 123 years. The dry desert climate, the cool sealed pot, and the absence of embalming chemistry had preserved something every geneticist before this had failed to recover from any ancient Egyptian. Inside the cementum of one tooth, the tissue locking the root into the jaw, the DNA was still intact. For 4 decades, the technology had not existed to read it. Egyptian DNA had been the white whale of ancient genomics since the 1980s. The climate was wrong, the embalming chemistry was wrong, and every sample collapsed under analysis. 3 partial genomes had been recovered in 40 years of effort, all from individuals who lived after the Greek and Roman conquests of Egypt. The dynastic core of Egyptian civilization, the period when the pyramids themselves were built, remained genetically silent. In July 2025, a team at the Francis Crick Institute and Liverpool John Moores University announced in Nature that the silence had broken. They drilled into the cementum of the NUWAYRAT man's tooth, extracted enough DNA to sequence his complete genome at 2 times coverage, and reconstructed his ancestry from scratch. He was approximately 78% North African and 22% Mesopotamian. The man buried with full Egyptian rites in an Egyptian tomb during the construction of the Great Pyramid was 1/5 descended from the population of the Eastern Fertile Crescent, more than 1,500 kilometers away. Cultural contact between early Egypt and Mesopotamia had been argued for over a century. Pottery shapes, cylinder seals, writing systems, and architectural motifs all suggested exchange across the corridor between the Tigris and the Nile. The conventional reading was trade. Goods moved, ideas moved, bodies stayed home. The genome from NUWAYRAT shows the bodies moved too. Real people, walking the route or sailing the Red Sea, settled in Egypt, married into Egyptian families, and folded their ancestry into the civilization whose monuments still define what we mean by the word ancient. The reconstructed face stares out of the nature paper with brown eyes and dark skin and the weathered build of a man who lived into his 60s in the Bronze Age. The skull, the pot, the tomb, the hands that buried him, and the rites they performed are all Egyptian, and the genome inside the bone says the line he came from did not start there. In 218 BC, a general from Carthage marched 37 war elephants and 40,000 infantry over the snow line of the Western Alps and into northern Italy to attack Rome from a direction Rome believed was impossible. The general's name was Hannibal. The army he led had been raised in the Phoenician colony his ancestors had built on the coast of modern Tunisia, 600 miles across the Mediterranean from the Phoenician homeland in Lebanon. For 2,000 years, the conventional account has held that Hannibal's soldiers were the descendants of the Phoenician sailors who founded Carthage from the city of Tyre. That the empire Rome eventually destroyed was a Levantine outpost transplanted to North Africa, and that the wars of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC were a long argument between an Italian peninsula and a Middle Eastern one. In April 2025, the genetic record was put on the stand for the first time. A team led by Harold Ringbauer at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and David Reich at Harvard published in Nature the largest ancient DNA survey ever conducted on a single ancient civilization. They had sequenced genomes from approximately 210 individuals buried at 14 Phoenician and Punic sites stretching from Lebanon to Spain, including the cemeteries of Carthage itself. The hypothesis going in was straightforward and almost unanimous in the field. The colonies would carry the genetic fingerprint of the Levant, diluted by intermarriage with local populations but recognizable beneath it. The Levantine site delivered what the field had predicted. Bodies buried in the Phoenician heartland of modern Lebanon carried Middle Eastern ancestry consistent with the populations the textbooks described. Then the data from the Western Mediterranean started to come in. The cemeteries at Ibiza, Sardinia, Sicily, southern Spain, and Carthage itself returned ancestry profiles that resembled ancient Greeks and Sicilians. The Levantine signal that should have anchored every Punic site was almost absent. Across hundreds of individuals, across cities founded as colonies of Tyre, across the population that produced Hannibal and burned at the hands of Scipio Aemilianus in 146 BC, the genetic contribution from the Phoenician homeland was vanishing thin. Two individuals buried in different Punic sites, one in North Africa and one in Sicily, turned out to be close genetic relatives, and neither of them was Levantine. The Punic population of Carthage was, in genetic terms, not Phoenician. What had moved across the Mediterranean was the alphabet, the worship of Baal and Tanit, the maritime economy, the trading customs, and the language itself. The bodies had not. Sailors from Lebanon had landed on shorelines already populated by people of Greek, Sicilian, and North African ancestry, and those local populations had adopted the Phoenician name and the Phoenician gods and built cities that called themselves Phoenician for the next 800 years. Carthage was not a Levantine city in North Africa. It was a Mediterranean city that spoke Phoenician. The war between Rome and Carthage, the war that produced Hannibal's elephants and Scipio's destruction of the city in 146 BC, was not the clash of civilizations the textbooks have framed it as for 2 millennia. It was a fight between two cities that shared more of their gene pool than either of them had with the homelands they each claimed. The story Rome told about its enemy and the story Carthage told about itself were both built on a lineage that the bones in their cemeteries refused to confirm. In June 2025, a team led by Vance Holliday at the University of Arizona published the result that ended a fight the field had been having for 4 years. Independent laboratories, using a third radiocarbon target the original critics had not been able to challenge, returned ages between 20,700 and 22,400 years for the sediments around a set of human footprints in the Tularosa Basin of southern New Mexico. The footprints belonged to people who had walked across the margin of a vanished lake during the coldest interval of the last ice age. They were 10,000 years older than the date every American archaeology textbook had defended for 90 years. The footprints had been announced in 2021. A USGS team led by Kathleen Springer and Jeff Pagati had reported in Science that human tracks pressed into the clay of an extinct Pleistocene lakebed at White Sands National Park dated to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. The implication was catastrophic. The Clovis first model, the consensus that humans first reached North America roughly 13,000 years ago by walking down an ice-free corridor through Canada, had been the foundation of every American archaeology curriculum since the 1930s. White Sands placed humans on the continent at the last glacial maximum, when the ice sheets the corridor depended on were fused shut from the Arctic to Montana. The response from the field was aggressive and immediate. Critics argued that the dating relied on the seeds of Ruppia serosa, an aquatic plant that absorbs carbon dissolved in old groundwater and returns ages that read older than the seed actually is. The pollen used as a secondary check had its own contamination risks. For 4 years, papers, rebuttals, and conference panels relitigated the case. The footprints sat in the gypsum, waiting. Holliday's 2025 paper attacked the problem from a direction the critics could not dismiss. His team radiocarbon dated ancient mud from the bed of Paleo Lake Otero, the vanished body of water that once covered 4,140 square kilometers of the Tularosa Basin. Mud does not absorb groundwater the way an aquatic seed does. The samples were run through laboratories with no connection to the original USGS team. The mud came back between 20,700 and 22,400 years old. 3 independent dating methods on 3 different materials from labs that did not collaborate all returned the same window. The footprints were real, the date was real, and the corridor story was finished. What the people who left those tracks were doing in New Mexico during the last glacial maximum is harder than impossible. The Bering land bridge they would have needed to cross was not yet exposed. The interior of North America was a wall of ice. The route the textbooks describe did not exist when these humans were already on the continent, hunting alongside mammoths and giant ground sloths whose tracks are pressed into the same lake bed. They came from somewhere, by a path that has not been mapped, before the model said anyone could be here at all. The footprints are not a mystery anymore. The mystery is everything the model needed them not to be. 400,000 years. That is the age of a patch of baked clay, a cracked flint hand axe, and 2 fragments of iron pyrite the size of a fingernail, all sitting together at the bottom of a clay pit near the village of Barnham in eastern Suffolk. Together, they are the earliest direct evidence of a human ancestor deliberately making fire that has ever been recovered anywhere on Earth. They push the timeline of controlled fire-making back by 350,000 years, and they belong to the species the modern human likes to think it replaced. For most of the last century, the textbook date for the controlled use of fire was tied to a Neanderthal site in northern France around 50,000 years ago. Earlier candidates had been proposed for sites in Israel, Kenya, and South Africa, some of them as old as 1 million years, but the field had never been able to rule out wildfire. A grassland strike from a lightning storm leaves the same charcoal signature as a hearth. The line between accidental burning and deliberate ignition required physical evidence that no site older than 50,000 years had ever produced. The Pathways to Ancient Britain project had been excavating Barnham since 2013. In 2017, archaeologist Simon Parfitt sieved a fragment of iron pyrite the size of a fingertip out of the clay near a patch of reddened sediment. Pyrite is not local to the geology of Suffolk. It does not weather out of British soil. It would have to have been carried to the site from somewhere else by someone who knew what it was for. The team kept digging. A second fragment of pyrite emerged. Around them, the sediment showed signs of repeated heating to over 700 degrees Celsius. Inside the hearth zone, a flint hand axe had cracked along the lines that only form when worked stone is subjected to high heat. In December 2025, a team led by Rob Davis and Nick Ashton at the British Museum published the result in Nature. The age came from a buried land surface beneath ancient pond deposits, sealed and stratigraphically locked. The hearth was 400,000 years old. Iron pyrite struck against flint produces sparks. The presence of pyrite at a site with no natural source, alongside repeated high-temperature burning, alongside heat-fractured flint, alongside a constructed pattern that does not match wildfire, was no longer interpretable as accident. The people at Barnham had been making fire, not finding it. The hominins who could have lit those sparks were not Homo sapiens. Our species would not exist for another 200,000 years. The closest contemporary human fossils to Barnham date to the same window and were recovered 80 miles south. They are early Neanderthals, the population that anatomically modern humans would later cross paths with, interbreed with, and outlive. The breakthrough that defines the human animal, the controlled use of fire that cooks food, hardens tools, extends the day, and warms the body through an ice age, did not happen first inside our species. It happened inside theirs. The Neanderthals did not vanish because they were primitive. They built the fire we are still standing around. In the karst caves of Guangxi province in southern China, archaeologists have spent decades pulling skeletons out of the floor that did not fit any pattern the textbooks recognized. The bodies were bound tightly into crouched positions, knees pulled up against the chest, arms folded in. Their bones carried burn marks that did not match cremation. The sites were Paleolithic, the oldest more than 12,000 years old, and a community of hunter-gatherers in a tropical climate that should have rotted any corpse within weeks had taken the effort to prepare them this carefully. In September 2025, a team led by Dr. Xiaochun Hung at the Australian National University published the answer in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The bodies had been mummified. The team analysed 54 pre-Neolithic burials from 11 sites across southern China and Southeast Asia. Using X-ray diffraction and Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, They identified the chemical signatures left in bone by extended exposure to low-temperature smoke. The bodies had been bound into their flexed postures shortly after death, suspended over slow, smoky fires for roughly 3 months, and dried into a preserved form before burial. Some of the Vietnamese examples, dated separately, were 14,000 years old. The previous textbook claim was that mummification began in the Chilean desert with the Chinchorro people around 7,000 years ago and in Egypt around 4,500 years ago. Both civilizations were arid and sedentary. Both were assumed to be the cradle of the human impulse to preserve the body across death. The Southeast Asian mummies are older than Chinchorro by 5,000 years and older than Egypt by 9,500. They were not produced in deserts by farmers. They were produced in dense, humid jungle by hunter-gatherers who carried no pottery and no agriculture in a climate actively hostile to preservation. The Dani people of the New Guinea highlands, who still mummify their dead in exactly this manner, demonstrate that the technique requires no settled civilization to maintain. The impulse to refuse decay did not begin with the desert civilizations the Western canon centers. It began 9,000 years earlier, in jungles the canon has never centered, with people whose names we do not know. The oldest mummies in the world are not in Egypt. They never were. 8,500 years ago, somewhere along the southern coast of Sicily, a small group of hunter-gatherers pushed a dugout canoe into the Mediterranean and began paddling south. The boat had been hollowed from a single tree trunk using fire and stone tools. Their target was a smudge of limestone cliffs 60 miles across open water, beyond the horizon for most of the journey. The crossing would take roughly 25 hours of continuous paddling at 4 kilometers per hour, which meant at least one full night in deep water with no land visible in any direction. For a century, the consensus on the peopling of the small Mediterranean islands had been built on a single principle. Remote islands were reached only by Neolithic farmers crossing the sea with crops, livestock, and pottery aboard purpose-built boats. The earliest accepted human settlement of Malta dated to about 7,400 years ago. Open sea crossings of that distance required the kind of organized society that did not exist before agriculture. In April 2025, a team led by Professor Eleanor Scarry at the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology published in Nature what they had been pulling out of a cave called Latnia in northern Malta. The site contained stone tools, hearths, and butchered animal bones sealed in stratigraphy that radiocarbon dated to 8,500 years ago. That is 1,000 years before the first farmers reached the island. The bones included red deer, tortoises, and large extinct birds. The presence of red deer on a small Mediterranean island means hunters had been working that landscape long enough to deplete what was there. The cave occupation suggests repeated returns. The crossing was a route, not a one-time accident. 100 kilometers of open water in a vessel with no sail. At least one overnight stretch beyond the sight of land. The seafaring skill the field had reserved for farmers building palaces had existed for at least 1,000 years before farming reached the island at all. The story of the Mediterranean as a series of stepping stones colonized by sedentary cultures in the order their pottery and crops permitted was written by people who were never asked to swim. The open sea did not wait for civilization. It was crossed by the people the textbook called too primitive to try. In 1948, an American archaeologist named MOVIUS drew a line across a map of the Old World and divided it into 2 cognitive zones. To the west of the line, in Europe, Africa, and Western Asia, hominins developed advanced stone tool technologies. To the east of the line, in India, southern China, and Southeast Asia, hominins were stuck producing what Movius called simple, core flake industries for hundreds of thousands of years. The Movius line became one of the most influential frameworks in 20th century archaeology. It defined why the deepest roots of technological civilization seemed to belong to the western half of the Old World. In January 2026, a team from the Chinese Academy of Sciences and Griffith University published in Nature Communications the results of an excavation at a site called Xigu in central China. They had recovered more than 2,600 stone tools from sediment dated between 160,000 and 72,000 years ago. The tools were hafted composite implements, stone blades fixed into wood or bone handles, the kind every MOVIUS-era textbook said East Asian hominins had not produced. The hafting technology at Sigu predated the earliest known composite tools in Europe. 4 months later, a second team published in the Journal of Human Evolution the result of more than a decade of excavation at Lingjing, also in central China. The site contained stone cores worked by a technique called centripetal flaking, in which flakes are removed in a coordinated radial pattern from a central platform. Centripetal flaking is the signature of advanced cognitive complexity in stone tool production. The Lingjing cores came back at 146,000 years old. The hominins working them were Homo juluensis, an extinct human relative whose name had not existed in the scientific literature 5 years ago. The MOVIUS line was not just an empirical claim. It was a framework that organized the geography of cognition itself. Generations of archaeologists were trained inside it. Generations of museum displays, university curricula, and popular science books were built on it. And in 2026, the framework that had survived 78 years collapsed under 2 papers published 4 months apart. The hominins working stone at Sigu and Lingjing were not waiting. They were not catching up. They were producing technology the framework had defined as impossible for them, using methods reserved for a different continent and a different lineage. What the MOVIUS line described was not the cognitive geography of the old world. It was the cognitive geography of the people who drew it.